Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he hammered the last nail into the fence post. The sun was already high in the sky, and the heat was getting unbearable. But this was his life now. Just him, his small herd of cattle, and the endless stretch of Texas wilderness that surrounded his little ranch. 7 long years had passed since Jake had seen another human face. 7 years since he'd packed up his few belongings and ridden away from civilization, looking for a place where no one could find him. He'd found it all right. His ranch sat in a hidden valley, surrounded by steep canyon walls that made it nearly impossible to reach. The closest town was 3 days away by horseback, and even the mail carriers refused to make the dangerous journey through the rocky paths. That's exactly how Jake wanted it. Every morning, he'd wake up before sunrise to the sound of his rooster crowing. He'd pull on his worn leather boots, grab his hat, and step outside to check on his animals. His 2 horses, Thunder and Lightning, would greet him with soft whinnies. The cattle would be scattered across the small pasture, chewing grass and swaying their tails to keep the flies away. Jake had built everything on this ranch with his own 2 hands. The small wooden house wasn't much to look at, but it kept him dry when the storms rolled in. The barn housed his horses and stored his supplies. He dug the well himself, hitting water after days of back-breaking work. Every board, every nail, every fence post represented hours of solitary labor. The silence was what struck visitors most, though Jake hadn't had any visitors in years. No rumble of wagon wheels, no voices calling across the yard, no children laughing and playing, just the wind whistling through the canyon walls, the occasional call of a hawk overhead, and the gentle lowing of his cattle. But Jake remembered a time when his world had been full of noise and laughter. He remembered the sound of his wife Catherine's voice singing while she cooked breakfast. He remembered his 5-year-old son Tommy running through the house, his little boots making tiny thunder sounds on the wooden floors. He remembered the bustling sounds of their old ranch near San Antonio, where neighbors would stop by for coffee and conversation. All of that had ended in the summer of 1878. The cholera outbreak had swept through their town like wildfire, taking the young and the healthy without warning. Catherine had gotten sick first, burning with fever that no amount of cool water could break. Jake had held her hand as she slipped away, promising he'd take care of Tommy. But within 3 days, the boy was showing the same symptoms. Jake had buried them both on a hill overlooking their old ranch, 2 simple wooden crosses marking the end of everything that had mattered to him. The neighbors had been kind, offering help and sympathy, but Jake couldn't bear to stay. Every corner of that ranch held memories that cut through him like knives. So, he'd sold everything except what he could carry, bought some cattle, and ridden west until he couldn't ride anymore. When he'd found this hidden valley, something inside him had said, "This is it. This is where you stop running." Now, 7 years later, Jake had created a routine that kept him busy from dawn to dusk. He'd wake up and tend to the animals, checking for injuries or signs of sickness. Then he'd work on whatever project needed attention, fixing fences, repairing tools, or building something new. In the afternoons, he'd hunt for fresh meat or work in his small vegetable garden, coaxing tomatoes and beans from the stubborn desert soil. Evenings were the hardest. When the work was done and the sun was setting behind the canyon walls, the loneliness would creep in like fog. Jake would sit on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Texas sky. Sometimes he'd talk to Thunder and Lightning, telling them about his day as if they could understand every word. The horses seemed to listen, flicking their ears and nodding their heads at appropriate moments. Jake had learned to be completely self-sufficient out of necessity. He could deliver a calf, set a broken bone, and stitch up a wound. He knew which plants were safe to eat and which ones would make him sick. He could read the weather by watching the clouds and predict storms by the way the animals behaved. His hands had grown calloused and strong from years of hard work, and his face had weathered to leather from the constant sun and wind. The nearest people were members of various tribes who sometimes passed through the area, but they always gave his valley a wide berth. Jake had occasionally spotted smoke signals in the distance, or found evidence of camps that had been abandoned days earlier. He respected their desire to avoid contact just as much as they seemed to respect his. Once a year, Jake would make the 3-day journey to the nearest town to buy supplies he couldn't make or grow himself: coffee, sugar, ammunition, and tools. The townspeople always stared at him like he was some kind of ghost, this wild-looking man who appeared once a year and disappeared just as quickly. He'd conduct his business in silence, load his pack animals, and head straight back to his valley on quiet nights. When the coyotes were howling in the distance and the fire was crackling in his fireplace, Jake would sometimes wonder if he was going crazy from the isolation. He'd catch himself having full conversations with his animals, or talking to Catherine and Tommy as if they were sitting right there beside him. But in the light of day, when there was work to be done and problems to solve, his mind felt sharp and clear. Jake had convinced himself that this was enough, that he could live out the rest of his days in this hidden valley, taking care of his animals and avoiding the pain that came with caring about people. He'd built walls around his heart just as surely as he'd built fences around his property. But deep down, in a place he tried not to examine too closely, Jake knew he was just marking time. He wasn't really living, he was just surviving, day after day, season after season. The grief that had driven him to this isolated place had never really healed. It had just been buried under years of routine and hard work. As Jake finished his work on the fence that day, he had no way of knowing that his life of isolation was about to change forever. He couldn't know that the next morning would bring visitors to his valley, visitors who would challenge everything he thought. He knew about himself and his ability to care about others again. For now, he was just a lonely cowboy who had chosen solitude over the risk of more heartbreak, living in a valley so remote that the rest of the world had forgotten he existed. But sometimes, just sometimes, late at night when the wind was still and the stars were bright, Jake Morrison wondered if he had forgotten how to exist in the world too. The morning of August 15, 1885, started like any other day for Jake Morrison. He rolled out of bed before dawn, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside to begin his daily routine. Thunder and lightning nickered softly as he approached their stall, and he patted their necks while checking their water trough. But something felt different that morning. The air seemed heavier, more still than usual. Even the birds weren't singing their typical morning songs. Jake paused, coffee cup in hand, and listened carefully to the sounds around him. After 7 years of living alone, he'd developed an almost supernatural sense for when something was out of place in his little corner of the world. At first, he thought it might be his imagination. Maybe the isolation was finally getting to him after all these years. But as he walked toward the pasture to check on his cattle, he noticed they were acting strange too. Instead of spreading out to graze like they normally did, they were bunched together near the far end of the field, their heads turned toward the eastern canyon wall. Jake squinted in that direction, but couldn't see anything unusual. The morning sun was just starting to peek over the rim of the canyon, casting long shadows across the valley floor. He went about his morning chores, but that nagging feeling wouldn't leave him alone. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. Around 10 o'clock, while he was repairing a broken harness in his barn, Jake heard thunder whinnying loudly from the corral. It wasn't the horse's usual greeting call. This was an alarm. Jake dropped his tools and stepped outside, shading his eyes against the bright sun. That's when he saw it. A small cloud of dust rising from the eastern approach to his valley, moving steadily in his direction. Jake's heart started beating faster. In 7 years, not a single soul had found their way to his hidden ranch. The path through the canyons was treacherous, known only to him and maybe a few Native American scouts who'd never bothered to visit. Jake ran, back into his house and grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace. His hands were shaking slightly as he checked to make sure it was loaded. He'd grown comfortable in his isolation, maybe too comfortable. He'd almost forgotten that the outside world could be a dangerous place. Positioning himself on his front porch, Jake watched the dust cloud grow larger. He could make out individual shapes now, riders on horseback, maybe 8 or 10 of them. As they came closer, his blood turned to ice water in his veins. These weren't lost travelers or cattle rustlers. The riders wore feathers and carried painted shields. They were Comanche warriors. Jake had heard plenty of stories about Comanche raids during his years living near San Antonio. They were skilled fighters and fierce protectors of their territory. Most white settlers lived in constant fear of Comanche war parties, and here was one riding directly toward his isolated ranch, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. But as the group drew even closer, Jake noticed something that didn't fit the stories he'd heard. The riders weren't charging at full speed, with weapons drawn. They were moving slowly, almost carefully, and in the front, an older man with an elaborate feathered headdress was holding up his right hand, palm facing forward. Jake had been around frontier life long enough to recognize that gesture. It was a sign of peace, not war. The leader of the group was an imposing figure, probably in his 50s, with graying hair braided with colored beads and feathers. His face was deeply lined from years in the sun, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He rode a magnificent painted horse that moved with the grace of an animal that had been perfectly trained. Behind him rode several younger warriors, their faces painted with red and white designs. But what surprised Jake most were the 2 young women riding near the back of the group. They were slumped forward in their saddles, clearly struggling to stay upright. Even from a distance, Jake could see they were sick. The chief, for that's clearly what he was, raised his hand higher and called out something in his native language. His voice was strong, but not threatening. Jake kept his rifle ready, but didn't aim it at anyone. His instincts told him these people hadn't come to fight. When the group was about 50 yards away, they stopped. The chief dismounted from his horse with fluid grace and walked forward alone, his hands visible and empty. As he got closer, Jake could see the worry lines etched deep around his eyes. "You, help," the chief said in broken English, gesturing toward the 2 sick women. "My daughters, very sick." Jake lowered his rifle slightly. Up close, he could see that the 2 young women were in bad shape. One was barely conscious, swaying dangerously in her saddle. The other was trying to stay alert but clearly fighting off fever. Their faces were flushed red, and they were breathing heavily. The chief continued speaking, mixing English words with Spanish and hand gestures. "Running Bear, my name, long journey, find help, daughters dying." Jake found himself stepping down from his porch. Everything he'd ever heard about the Comanche suggested he should be running for his life right now. But looking at this father's desperate face, all he could see was another parent trying to save his children. "Fever?" Jake asked, pointing toward the young women. Chief Running Bear nodded vigorously. "Fire, inside. 3 days, getting worse." Jake understood immediately. He'd seen this kind of fever before, the same sickness that had killed his own wife and son 7 years ago. If these young women had been traveling for 3 days while sick, they were in serious danger. "Water," Jake said, pointing toward his well. "Bring them water." Chief Running Bear turned and spoke rapidly to his warriors in Comanche. 2 of them immediately dismounted and carefully helped the sick women down from their horses. Jake could see now that they were both young, probably in their early 20s, with long black hair, damp with sweat from the fever. As the warrior supported the 2 daughters, Jake found himself making a decision that would have seemed impossible just an hour earlier. He was inviting a Comanche war party to make camp on his property. 7 years of isolation had ended in the most unexpected way possible. Shade, Jake said, pointing toward a large tree near his well. Rest, shade, cool water. Chief Running Bear's weathered face showed the first hint of relief Jake had seen since the group arrived. Thank you, he said in careful English. Thank you, for my daughters. Jake nodded and walked toward his house to get medical supplies, his mind racing. He had some willow bark tea that Catherine had taught him to make for fevers. He had clean cloths and cool well water. Maybe, just maybe, he could help save these young women's lives. As he gathered his supplies, Jake realized his hands had stopped shaking. For the first time in 7 years, he had a purpose that went beyond just surviving another day. He had people who needed his help, and despite everything that separated them, language, culture, and years of mistrust between their peoples, he was going to do everything in his power to help them. Jake hurried back outside, with his arms full of supplies, clean cloths, a tin cup, and a small leather pouch containing willow bark that his wife Catherine had taught him to use for fevers. His heart was pounding, but for the first time in years. It wasn't from fear or loneliness. It was from the urgent need to help someone else. The Comanche warriors had gently laid the 2 young women in the shade of the large oak tree near Jake's well. Chief Running Bear was kneeling beside them, speaking softly in their native language, while stroking their fevered foreheads. Even though Jake couldn't understand the words, he could hear the love and worry in the father's voice. Jake approached slowly, not wanting to startle anyone. The warriors watched him carefully, but didn't reach for their weapons. Up close, he could see just how sick the 2 daughters really were. Their skin was burning hot and flushed red, their breathing was fast and shallow, and they seemed to drift in and out of consciousness. Names? Jake asked quietly, pointing to the young women. Chief Running Bear looked up at him with grateful eyes. White Dove, he said, touching the shoulder of the older daughter. Morning Star, he added, indicating the younger one who seemed even sicker. Jake nodded and knelt down beside them. I make medicine. For fever, he said, hoping his simple English was getting through. He held up the willow bark and mimed, drinking from the tin cup. The chief watched intently as Jake walked to his well and drew up a bucket of cool, clear water. Jake had dug this well himself during his first year in the valley, and the water had never failed him. Now, it might help save these young women's lives. Jake started a small fire and put some water on to boil in a pot. While he waited, he soaked some clean cloths in the cool well water and handed them to Chief Running Bear. Forehead, Jake said, demonstrating by placing a cloth on his own head. Cool, fever. The chief understood immediately and began gently placing the wet cloths on his daughters' burning foreheads. The relief on their faces was immediate, even though they were barely conscious. As the water came to a boil, Jake carefully added pieces of willow bark to make tea. Catherine had taught him that willow bark could bring down fevers and ease pain. He'd used it on sick cattle over the years, but never on people since losing his family. Now, watching these 2 young women fight for their lives, all of Catherine's lessons came flooding back to him. My wife? She know medicine, Jake said quietly to Chief Running Bear while they waited for the tea to cool. She, gone now, but she'll teach me. The chief nodded solemnly. Even with the language barrier, grief was something both men understood perfectly. When the willow bark tea had cooled enough to drink, Jake helped White Dove sit up slightly. She opened her eyes and looked at him with confusion and fear. Here was this strange white man she'd never seen before, trying to give her something to drink. Chief Running Bear spoke to her gently in Comanche, explaining what was happening. Whatever he said seemed to reassure her, because she allowed Jake to help her drink the bitter tea. Morning Star was too weak to sit up, so they had to drip small amounts into her mouth very slowly. Over the next few hours, something remarkable began to happen. The wet cloths and willow bark tea started to bring down the young women's fevers. Their breathing became easier, and they were able to stay awake for longer periods. Jake kept boiling fresh tea and soaking new cloths in cool water, working tirelessly alongside Chief Running Bear as the day wore on. The language barrier started to break down in small ways. White Dove, who seemed to be recovering faster than her sister, began speaking to Jake in careful English mixed with Spanish words. "You, good man," she whispered weakly during one of her conscious moments. "Why, you help us?" Jake paused in his work, surprised by the question. Why was he helping them? A week ago, if someone had told him he'd be nursing sick Comanche women back to health, he would have thought they were crazy. "Because, you need help," he said simply. "And your father, he love you." "I understand, love for family." White Dove studied his face with intelligent dark eyes. Despite her illness, Jake could see she was sharp and observant. "You have, family?" she asked. Jake's throat tightened. "Had family, long time ago. They, sick too. I couldn't help them." Understanding passed between them, without need for more words. White Dove reached out weakly and touched Jake's weathered hand. "I'm sorry," she said clearly in English. By evening, both daughters were sitting up and able to drink the willow bark tea on their own. The crisis had passed. Chief Running Bear looked 10 years younger with relief, and he kept trying to find ways to thank Jake despite the language barrier. "My people. We remember this," the chief said seriously, placing his hand over his heart. "You save my daughters, you, good friend to Running Bear." Jake felt something stir inside him that he hadn't experienced in 7 years, the warmth of human connection and the satisfaction of helping others. These people were supposed to be his enemies, according to everything he'd been told, but sitting around his small campfire that night, they just felt like fellow human beings who had been through a difficult time together. White Dove was feeling well enough to serve as a translator between her father and Jake. Through her, Chief Running Bear began telling Jake about their journey. They had traveled for weeks, searching for someone who might be able to help his daughters. Other white settlements had either turned them away or tried to attack them on sight. "My father says you are different from other white men," White Dove translated. "He wants to know why you live alone, away from your people." Jake stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "I lost everything that mattered to me, came here to forget, to hide." When White Dove translated this, Chief Running Bear nodded with deep understanding. He spoke for several minutes in Comanche, while his daughter listened carefully. "My father says he understands hiding from pain," White Dove said softly. "He says our people are being pushed from our lands. Many of our friends and family are gone. Sometimes he wants to hide too." Jake looked across the fire at Chief Running Bear and saw something he recognized in the older man's eyes, the look of someone who had lost more than he could bear, but kept going anyway, despite their different backgrounds and languages. They shared the common experience of grief and survival. Morning Star, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, suddenly spoke up in halting English. "You, lonely here." Jake was surprised to hear her speak English at all. "Yes," he admitted. "Very lonely." She smiled weakly. "We, lonely too. Always moving, always afraid." As the stars came out over the valley that night, Jake realized something had fundamentally changed in his carefully ordered world of isolation. These people had brought more than just illness to his valley. They had brought the possibility of connection, understanding, and maybe even hope. The next morning brought clear skies, and the first real smiles Jake had seen from White Dove and Morning Star. Both young women were sitting up on their own, their fevers completely broken, and their eyes bright with returning health. Jake felt a deep satisfaction watching them laugh quietly together as they shared some of his cornbread and coffee. Chief Running Bear had been planning to leave that morning, but as he watched his daughters gain strength, he seemed to change his mind. Through White Dove's translation, He asked Jake if they could stay another day to make sure. The sickness was truly gone. Jake found himself nodding before he'd even thought about it. The idea of returning to complete silence and solitude suddenly felt overwhelming. "Stay as long as you need," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. What began as an extra day of recovery turned into something. Neither Jake nor Chief Running Bear had expected a genuine exchange of knowledge and friendship that bridged two completely different worlds. White Dove, Jake quickly discovered, had an amazing gift for languages. She had learned English from traders who visited their camps, Spanish from Mexican settlers, and even some French from explorers who had passed through their territory. She was hungry to learn more, and Jake found himself becoming an unwilling teacher. "How do you say this?" she would ask, pointing to different objects around his ranch. She learned the English words for hammer, fence, cattle, and well, with the enthusiasm of someone collecting precious treasures. In return, White Dove taught Jake basic Comanche words. She showed him how to say hello, which sounded like ha, and thank you, which was yura. Jake's pronunciation made both daughters giggle, but they were patient teachers, repeating the words slowly until he got them right. Morning Star, who was quieter than her sister, but equally observant, became fascinated with Jake's vegetable garden. She walked among his tomato plants and beanstalks with the careful attention of someone who understood growing things. Through White Dove's translation, she began sharing knowledge that amazed Jake. "She says, you plant your beans wrong," White Dove said with an apologetic smile. "She can show you better way." Jake bristled slightly at first. He'd been growing vegetables for 7 years and thought he knew what he was doing, but his pride melted away when Morning Star knelt down and gently showed him how to arrange the bean plants so they supported each other while growing. It was a technique he'd never seen before, and it made perfect sense. Morning Star also showed Jake plants growing wild around his valley that he'd never paid attention to. Some could be eaten, others had healing properties he'd never known about. She pointed to a common weed that grew near his well and explained through White Dove that it could stop bleeding and help wounds heal faster. "Your wife knew this?" White Dove asked as Jake carefully examined the plant. "No," Jake admitted. "She knew some things, but not this. Your sister, ... She knows much more." Morning Star blushed at the compliment, but continued her lessons. She showed Jake how to identify plants that could ease stomach problems, reduce inflammation, and even help someone sleep better. All of this knowledge had been growing right around his ranch, and he'd walked past it every day without realizing its value. Chief Running Bear, meanwhile, was studying Jake's cattle operation with the keen eye of someone who understood animals. Jake's small herd was healthy and well cared for, but the chief had ideas about how to make things even better. Through gestures and White Dove's translation, Chief Running Bear explained how his people managed their horses. He showed Jake different ways to read animal behavior and predict when weather changes might affect the herd. The chief had spent his entire life working with animals, and his knowledge ran deep. "Your cattle happy here," the chief observed, through White Dove, "but they could be happier." Jake was curious, despite himself, how Chief Running Bear pointed to how Jake's cattle were clustering in one part of the pasture. He explained that moving them to different areas regularly would help the grass grow back stronger and keep the animals healthier. It was a simple idea, but Jake had never thought of it. As the days passed, Jake found himself sharing stories of his own past. He told them about his life before the isolation, about his wife Catherine and son Tommy, about the ranch near San Antonio, where he'd been happy once upon a time. White Dove translated his stories for her father and sister, and Jake could see understanding and sympathy in their faces daughter in return. Chief Running Bear shared stories of his people's life on the plains. He spoke of great buffalo herds that stretched beyond the horizon, of the freedom of moving with the seasons, of traditions that had been passed down for countless generations. But he also spoke of the sadness his people felt as their way of life was disappearing. My father says the world is changing too fast, White Dove translated during one of their evening conversations. The buffalo are almost gone. The soldiers push us onto smaller and smaller lands. Young people are forgetting the old ways. Jake listened to these stories with growing understanding. Chief Running Bear wasn't just a warrior or a leader. He was a father trying to protect his family in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything he'd ever known. In many ways, his grief and displacement mirrored Jake's own losses. One afternoon, while Morning Star was showing Jake more medicinal plants, White Dove approached him with a serious expression on her face. "Can I ask you something?" she said, quietly. Jake nodded, setting down the plant he'd been examining. "Why did you really help us?" she asked. "Most white men would have shot at us before we could explain why we came." Jake thought about her question for a long moment. "When I saw your father's face, when he was asking for help, I saw myself 7 years ago, trying to save my wife and son. I couldn't help them, but maybe I could help you." White Dove was quiet for a while, processing his words. "You are not like other white men I have met," she said finally. "Your family is not like the Comanche I heard about in the stories either," Jake replied. "Maybe the stories we tell about each other aren't always true." That evening, as they sat around the fire sharing Jake's rabbit stew, Chief Running Bear made an announcement that surprised everyone. Through White Dove, he said he wanted to give Jake a Comanche name. "He says you are helps others in our language," White Dove translated, with a smile. "It is a good name, a name of honor." Jake felt something warm spread through his chest. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had honored him for anything. For 7 years, he'd thought of himself as a failure, a man who couldn't save his family and had run away from life. But Chief Running Bear saw something different in him. As the fire died down and the stars came out over the valley, Jake realized that something fundamental had changed in his carefully ordered world of solitude. These people had not just recovered from their illness in his valley, they had brought it back to life. For the first time since Catherine and Tommy died, Jake felt like he was truly living again, instead of just surviving. The morning that Chief Running Bear and his daughters were supposed to leave had come and gone 3 days ago. None of them seemed in any hurry to continue their journey, and Jake found himself hoping they would stay even longer. The valley that had felt like a lonely prison for 7 years, now felt alive with voices, laughter, and the warmth of human companionship. But Jake could see that Chief Running Bear was wrestling with a difficult decision. The older man would often sit by himself in the early morning hours, staring out at the canyon walls, as if trying to solve some impossible puzzle. His daughters were completely recovered now, strong enough to travel wherever they needed to go. There was no medical reason to stay any longer. On the 4th morning after they should have left, Chief Running Bear asked White Dove to translate something important he wanted to say to Jake. The whole family gathered around the morning fire, their faces more serious than Jake had seen them since the first day they arrived. "My father has something to ask you," White Dove said carefully. "Something unusual." Jake set down his coffee cup and gave Chief Running Bear his full attention. Over the past week, he'd learned to read the older man's expressions, and this was clearly something that had been weighing heavily on his mind. Chief Running Bear spoke for several minutes in Comanche, his voice low and thoughtful. White Dove listened intently, occasionally asking him questions to make sure she understood correctly. When he finished, she took a deep breath before turning to Jake. "My father says you are a good man who lives alone by choice, not because you have to," she began. "He says you understand loss and pain like our people do. He says you respect the land and know how to survive without taking more than you need." Jake nodded, wondering where this was leading. White Dove continued, "He wants to know if you would consider coming with us. Living with our people for a while. Winter is coming, and it will be hard for everyone. You have skills we could use, And maybe, maybe we have things to teach you too. Jake felt like the ground had shifted under his feet. Leave his valley. Leave the refuge he'd built so carefully over 7 years. The idea seemed impossible. But, as he looked around at these people who had become so important to him in such a short time, Jake realized that his valley no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a beautiful cage that he'd built for himself out of fear and grief. I don't know, Jake said honestly. This place, it's all I have. Chief Running Bear seemed to understand Jake's hesitation without needing translation. He stood up and walked over to place a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice was kind but firm. My father says this place will always be here, White Dove translated. But chances to live, to help people, to be part of something bigger, those chances don't come often. He says he sees something in you that you maybe don't see in yourself. Morning Star, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, suddenly spoke up in her careful English. You, saved our lives. Maybe, we save yours too. Jake felt tears sting his eyes. This young woman, barely recovered from near death, was offering to save him, and maybe she was right. Maybe his life did need saving from the slow death of isolation and endless grief. What would I do with your people? Jake asked. I don't know your ways. I can't even speak your language properly. White Dove smiled. You learn fast, and you know things we need to know. How to work with cattle, how to build strong houses, how to make the white man's medicines. Our people are changing whether we want to or not. We need someone who can help us learn new ways, while keeping the good parts of the old ways. Chief Running Bear spoke again, and this time his tone was more urgent. He says winter will be especially hard this year, White Dove translated. The soldiers have moved many tribes to smaller lands. There won't be enough food for everyone. But if someone could teach us better ways to raise animals and grow food in one place, maybe fewer people would go hungry. Jake suddenly understood. They weren't just inviting him to join them, they were asking him to help them survive a world that was trying to destroy their way of life. It was a responsibility that both terrified and honored him. And if I come, Jake said slowly, what happens in the spring? Chief Running Bear smiled for the first time that morning and spoke a single sentence in Comanche. He says that depends on you, White Dove translated. You can return here, or stay with us, or there might be other choices too. Jake looked around his valley one more time. The little house he'd built with his own hands, the well he'd dug. During his first lonely year, the cattle that had been his only companions for so long. All of it had kept him alive, but none of it had made him feel alive. Give me until tonight to decide, Jake said finally. As the day passed, Jake found himself seeing his valley differently. Instead of the refuge it had been, it now looked like a hiding place. Instead of the home he'd built, it looked like a tomb he'd been living in. Catherine and Tommy weren't here. They were buried 3 days right away. He'd been hiding from their memory instead of honoring it. That evening, as they sat around the fire for what might be the last time, Jake made his decision. I'll come with you, he said quietly, but I want to come back here in the spring. This valley it's still part of me. I'm not ready to leave it forever. Chief Running Bear's face lit up with genuine joy. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, his voice filled with excitement and gratitude. My father says you bring honor to our people by choosing to help us, White Dove translated, tears of happiness in her eyes. He says you will always have a place with us, and this valley will always be here when you want to return. Morning Star surprised everyone by throwing her arms around Jake in an enthusiastic hug. You, family now, she said in English, beaming at him. As Jake prepared for the journey over the next few days, he realized that something miraculous had happened. He had spent 7 years trying to bury his grief and forget his capacity for love. But Chief Running Bear and his daughters hadn't let him succeed. They had reminded him that isolation wasn't healing, connection was. On the morning they finally left the valley, Jake looked back one last time at the life he was leaving behind. But for the first time since Catherine and Tommy died, he wasn't running away from something. He was walking toward something new, something that honored both his past and his future. The lonely cowboy who had lived in isolation for 7 years was gone. In his place rode Jake Morrison, a man who had learned that the best way to heal from loss wasn't to avoid caring about people, it was to care about them even more.